A leather scroll, 2,000 years old, found in a cave above the Dead Sea in 1947. Nobody was looking for it. The boy who found it was looking for a lost goat. What he broke open that morning was a clay jar, sealed with care, placed in the dark by people who believed what they were preserving was worth more than anything else they owned, including, as it turned out, their lives. They sealed it. They climbed the cliff, and they did not come back for the scrolls. What was inside that jar is what we are opening tonight. This is not a story anyone invented. The scroll exists. It sits today behind glass in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, in a room called the Shrine of the Book. Its Hebrew name is the Megillat Ha-Milhamah. Its 19 columns of text describe, in precise military detail, the final war between two forces. The scroll calls by two names that have never stopped echoing: the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. You do not need to watch. You do not need to stay awake. Just let these ancient words carry you, the way the desert carried the jar across 2,000 years of silence, patient and unhurried, holding what it was given until the right moment arrived. The lamp is low, the scroll is open. Let us begin. Chapter 1. The Cave and the Broken Jar. Something broke open in a cave above the Dead Sea in the early weeks of 1947, and the world of ancient texts has not been the same since. Not the world of headlines and governments. The quieter world. The one where people lie awake, wondering whether the darkness they are in is the whole story or only part of one. For that world, what broke open in that cave has mattered in ways that do not always announce themselves loudly and do not always arrive quickly. But the story begins simply. A boy. A goat that wandered. A stone thrown into a dark opening in a pale limestone cliff. His name was Muhammad Ed-Deeb. He was 15 years old, or thereabouts. He was a member of the Tamira Bedouin tribe, and on that particular morning he had been tending animals in the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in a stretch of pale limestone that drops sharply toward the lowest point on the surface of the earth, 430 meters below sea level. The air there is dry in a way that feels almost aggressive. The sun reflects off the rock and off the blue-gray water below simultaneously, so that even on a cool morning, the heat arrives from two directions at once. One of the goats wandered off the usual path. Muhammad climbed after it, trusting his feet on the rock and not thinking too much about where the path was going. He found a cave opening, almost by accident. A dark gap in the pale cliff face, low enough that a person would have to duck to enter. He threw a stone inside, the way you do when you are not sure what is waiting in the dark. Not brave, not afraid. Just a boy checking a cave the way boys have always checked caves. The sound he heard was not what he expected. A sharp crack, then something hollow. Not rock hitting rock. Something harder but more fragile. Something made. He went back to camp and told another boy named Juma what he had found, and the two of them returned. Along the walls of the cave, embedded in the floor sediment, were tall cylindrical jars. Most were broken or empty, or packed with wind-blown dirt that had filtered through the limestone over centuries of patient silence. But two of the jars were intact, and inside them, wrapped in linen cloth, darkened and stiffened with age, were the scrolls. The boys took them. They did not know they were standing in the middle of the most significant biblical discovery of the 20th century. They were teenagers who had found something strange and took it the way people take things they do not yet understand, hoping understanding will come later. What happened next has a strangeness all its own. The scrolls passed through several hands before they reached people who understood what they held. Some were acquired by a Syrian Orthodox archbishop who eventually brought them to the United States. They ended up sitting in a bank vault in New Jersey, the oldest known Hebrew biblical manuscript in existence, waiting in a safe deposit box, while the Archbishop placed an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal seeking a buyer. That detail never loses its strangeness. The most significant Hebrew manuscript in the world, in New Jersey, for sale. In 1954, the scrolls were purchased on behalf of the newly established State of Israel by a team that included the archaeologist Eliezer Sukenik, who had recognized their importance immediately upon first seeing photographs. He wrote in his diary the night he confirmed the purchase that he had been holding the earliest record of a world that had given rise to his own. The scrolls were returned to Jerusalem, where they have remained ever since in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum, in a vault built in the shape of the lid of the very jars in which they were found. Within 2 years of the initial discovery, the academic world was in a state of barely controlled excitement. The scrolls included a complete copy of the Book of Isaiah, older by 1,000 years than any previously known Hebrew manuscript of that text. They included documents describing the rules and practices of a religious community that had apparently lived in the desert and left almost no other record of its existence. And among all of them, found in that same first cave, was a scroll unlike any of the others. Not a copy of scripture, not a commentary, not a hymn. Something no one had expected to find in a clay jar on a desert cliff. A battle plan. 19 columns of text, written in a clear and assured hand, describing in precise military detail the formations, the equipment, the signal protocols, and the order of battle for the final war between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness. The War Scroll. It sits today in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, 2,000 years old and still legible. Before we go any further, I want to be honest with you, the way I try to be honest at the beginning of every night, like this one. The War Scroll is not scripture. It does not carry the authority of the Bible. It was written by members of a religious community in the Judean desert who believed, with the full weight of their organized lives behind that belief, that they were living in the generation before the final conflict between good and evil. What I will tell you tonight is what the scroll imagines, what the Qumran community believed about the shape of that final battle. I will not present it as more than that, because honesty is the only foundation worth building a night like this upon. Now let me tell you something about the jar before we leave it. The cylindrical jars found in the caves were not ordinary storage vessels repurposed in an emergency. They were purpose-made for this specific function. Tall, with carefully fitted lids, sealed against the desert air with a precision that kept leather intact for 20 centuries. Archaeologists who examined them found a type not present in significant quantities anywhere else in the region. Someone had commissioned these jars before the emergency arrived. Someone had understood, perhaps years before the Roman army appeared on the horizon, that a moment might come when the library would need to be hidden. Someone had been making jars. There is a Hebrew word that appears repeatedly in the oldest of the Qumran scrolls. The word is emet. It is usually translated as truth, but its root meaning reaches deeper than that single English word. Emet means firmness, reliability, the quality of being present in the same faithful way, doing the same careful thing, regardless of what the circumstances around you are doing. A wall is emet when it holds under pressure. A jar is emet when it stays sealed for 2,000 years in a limestone cave above the Dead Sea. The emet of those jars is why the War Scroll reached us intact, and the emet of a teenage shepherd who followed a lost goat into an unexpected part of the cliff is how it was found. Both kinds of faithfulness were necessary. The patient kind that made the jars, and the ordinary accidental kind that went looking for something else entirely. Let your breathing slow. The pale cliffs above the Dead Sea look exactly tonight as they looked on that morning in 1947. The same limestone, the same dry air, the same silence that held those words safe across more than 100 generations of human life. The cave is empty now. The scroll is in the light. and we have only just arrived at the edge of what it contains. Chapter 2. The People Who Wrote the Plan. Before we open the war scroll itself, we need to understand who wrote it. This is the part of the story that most people rush through, impatient to reach the battle plan and the angels and the final confrontation between light and darkness. But if you skip the community that produced this document, you will hear the scroll as an abstract theological curiosity rather than what it actually is, which is the product of real human beings living a specific kind of life in response to a specific kind of darkness. They had watched consume everything around them. Understanding them changes everything about what you hear when they write about the war. The site of Qumran sits on a narrow plateau at the northwestern edge of the Dead Sea, at the base of the cliffs where the caves are. The landscape does not offer comfort in the usual sense. It has no lushness, no shade. What it has is severity, stillness, the kind of silence that has texture to it, that you can feel against your skin when the wind drops and the last sound of it fades into the limestone. The community that built their settlement here was occupied, with some interruptions, from roughly the 2nd century before Christ until the year 68 of the Common Era, when the Roman army arrived and ended it. At its peak, it probably housed somewhere between 100 and 200 people. They shared meals in a large communal room. They carved an elaborate network of channels and cisterns into the plateau to collect and store rainwater. They maintained a long, narrow room where scrolls were copied, where the dried inkwells and the stone benches are still visible in the ruins 2,000 years later. They had left Jerusalem. That was the central fact about them. They had left on purpose. To understand why, you have to understand what Jerusalem was in the 2nd century before Christ. The city was not simply a place of worship. It was a center of political power. The high priesthood, which controlled the temple and therefore the entire religious economy of Jewish life, had become entangled with foreign rulers in ways that many deeply faithful Jews found intolerable. Men had purchased the office of high priest. The sacred calendar had become a matter of political negotiation rather than divine command. The holy days that were supposed to structure all of Jewish worship were being set by men who had bought their positions from foreign kings. Think about what that would have felt like from the inside. Your entire life organized around a sacred rhythm, the feast days and Sabbaths and new moons that mark time as holy, that connect ordinary mornings to the story of a God who made the world and liberated his people. And now the people responsible for maintaining that rhythm are doing so on terms set by an occupying power in exchange for their continued authority. For some people, this was a compromise they could learn to live with. They stayed in Jerusalem. They told themselves that imperfect faithfulness was still faithfulness. For others, it was not a compromise they could make. The group most scholars associate with the Qumran community is a movement known as the Essenes. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, describes them with evident admiration. They rejected personal wealth and shared everything they owned. They rose before dawn to pray. They studied their texts with an intensity that Josephus, who was not himself an Essene, called remarkable, even to an outside observer. Their own scrolls refer to a founding figure they call the teacher of righteousness. A priest, the texts suggest, who had been wrongfully removed from his position by someone the scrolls call the wicked priest, and who led his followers into the wilderness to preserve what he believed was the true interpretation of the covenant. He left everything: position, influence, institutional standing. Whatever security and recognition came with a role in the temple establishment, he walked away from all of it and went into a desert that offered nothing but the covenant itself. And people followed him, because the covenant was enough. The teacher of righteousness is never named in the scrolls. We do not know who he was with certainty, but his influence runs through the entire collection. They quote him. They interpret scripture through his lens. And the community he founded held together in the desert for nearly 2 centuries after his death. Their daily life had a structure that is almost impossible to imagine sustaining for a week, let alone 2 centuries. They woke before dawn for morning prayer. Work followed, the practical communal labor that keeps a desert settlement alive. The midday brought study. The evening meal was treated with the solemnity of a sacred rite, bread and wine blessed and broken in a communal room. The meal eaten in silence or accompanied by the reading of texts. After the meal, more study. Late into the night, membership required 2 full years of probation. In the first year, a candidate lived alongside the community and observed, but did not eat at the communal table and retained their property. In the second year, if the community voted to accept them, they participated in the meals but still kept their possessions. Only after both years, if a final community vote confirmed their acceptance, did they surrender everything they owned into the common pool and become full members. Think about what the table meant in that context. 2 years of watching before you were allowed to eat there. 2 years of being present without being included. And then, when the vote was finally taken and confirmed, the meal, bread blessed and broken, wine blessed and shared. The priest acting first, on behalf of all. And after that, every evening, the same ritual, the same blessing, the same silence. Every evening, the bread, the wine, the blessing, for nearly 200 years. Think about what that means, not as theology, but as a human fact. Think about the people who sat down at that table when they were young and idealistic, and the people who were still sitting there 30 years later, slower and more weathered, with fewer certainties but perhaps a deeper kind of steadiness. Think about the evenings when someone was absent because they were sick. Think about the last evening when the bread was blessed and the wine was shared and nobody knew it was the last time. The scroll was written by people who understood that kind of time. People who had organized their entire existence around the conviction that faithfulness done daily in small, unheroic ways, in the middle of a world that offered no applause for it, was the thing that mattered most. And then the Roman army came, and they had perhaps days, perhaps hours, to decide what to do with everything they had built. They gathered the scrolls. They wrapped them in linen. They put them in the jars that someone had been making for exactly this moment. The writing was the preparation. The library was the testimony. Let your breathing slow. The lamplight in the scriptorium is still. The desert air is the same it has been for 10,000 years, patient and exact, keeping faith with everything placed inside it. The scroll is ahead of us, but there is no hurry. The plan has been waiting 2,000 years. It will wait a little longer while you rest. Chapter 3. 2 armies and the doctrine behind the names. The war scroll opens without ceremony. No prologue. No dedication. No explanation of what has come before. The very first line moves directly to the matter, as if the reader has been waiting and the scribe has no time for anything but the thing itself. The scroll imagines the opening of the final conflict with words that scholars translate as something like, "The first attack of the sons of light shall be undertaken against the forces of the sons of darkness, the army of Belial." That is the first sentence. And compressed inside it, in a space smaller than a single breath, are 2 names that have echoed through human history across 2,000 years since that jar was first sealed. Sons of light, sons of darkness. Before we follow them into battle, we need to understand what those names actually meant to the people who wrote them. Because the temptation for a modern reader is to hear them as simple opposites, the good side and the bad side, the team in white jerseys and the team in black jerseys. If you hear them that way, you will miss almost everything the scroll is actually saying. The scroll imagines the sons of light in specific terms. They are the men of the covenant, the community that has remained faithful to the law of God in the wilderness, waiting for the moment when the age of wickedness ends and the age of righteousness begins. But the scroll also extends the category outward. Alongside the human community stand the angels. The scroll names 4 angelic princes appointed to fight alongside the sons of light, not above them and not instead of them, but with them in the same formations. The 4 named in the document are Michael, Gabriel, and 2 others whose names appear in different scholarly translations as either Sariel or Uriel, the variation reflecting genuine difficulty reading that portion of the manuscript. That word alongside deserves your full attention. The scroll does not say the angels will fight on behalf of the faithful, while the faithful watch. According to the scroll's vision, they fight together. The human army and the angelic army occupy the same formations, hold the same ground, face the same enemy at the same time. Now, the sons of darkness. The scroll identifies them with a specificity that anchors the document firmly in its historical moment. The first enemy named is the Kittim. Most scholars identify the Kittim in the period when the war scroll was most likely written, as the term the Qumran community used for the Romans, the army of the Western Sea, the army that had placed its standards in the streets of Jerusalem. The scroll also names the surrounding peoples, Edom, Moab, Ammon, the Philistines, nations with real armies and real histories of conflict with Israel. And then comes the detail that requires the most honesty to examine. Among the sons of darkness, the scroll includes members of the Jewish community itself. Not all Jewish people, not even most. It is identifying, with painful specificity, those within the covenant community who had accommodated the foreign powers at the cost of the covenant. Men who had purchased the office of high priest. Men who had kept the external forms of the faith while emptying them of the faithfulness that gave those forms their meaning. That detail is uncomfortable, and I want to be honest about it. History is full of communities that believed they alone had maintained the original purity of the faith while everyone else had compromised, and that self-understanding has caused serious harm in many times and places. The Qumran community was not exempt from that danger. But here is what separates what they actually did from the more dangerous versions of that same self-understanding. They went to the desert. They did not take up arms against anyone. They wrote down what they believed would happen, organized their communal lives around the covenant they were trying to preserve, and left the prosecution of the final judgment entirely in the hands of God. The War Scroll does not stand alone as a theological document. It draws on a theology developed most clearly in its companion document, the Community Rule found in Cave 1. That text contains a passage scholars call the Treatise on the Two Spirits, and it describes the ground beneath the military language of the War Scroll. According to the treatise, God placed 2 spirits in humanity at the moment of creation. The spirit of truth leads toward light, toward righteousness, toward the covenant. The spirit of falsehood leads toward darkness, toward wickedness, toward destruction. Every human being lives under the influence of both spirits, in varying proportions, throughout their life. The final conflict between light and darkness, the scroll imagines, is not only a cosmic battle between 2 external armies. It is the resolution, on the largest possible scale, of a tension that has existed inside every human heart since creation began. That is the theological ground beneath the military language. The sons of light and the sons of darkness are not simply 2 external armies. They are the ultimate expression of a conflict that the Qumran community understood to be playing out inside every person who had ever lived. The war is cosmic in scale. The categories are personal in application, and the community that wrote the War Scroll lived inside those categories every single day, not just as future hope, but as present reality. There is a reason this language has survived 2,000 years and still resonates when people hear it tonight. Every generation has known the shape of these 2 sides, not always in cosmic dimensions, usually in the ordinary scale of a single human being trying to figure out, in a specific quiet moment of a specific difficult day, which spirit they are listening to. The scroll was written for that feeling as much as for the final conflict. The 2 armies are named The theology beneath the names has been opened. The night is quiet. Let your breathing find its own rhythm before we move to the plan itself. Chapter 4. 40 Years and the War That Kept the Sabbath. When you open a battle plan, the first thing you expect is a timetable. How long? How many phases? How many days before the outcome is decided? The war scroll has an answer, and the answer is one of the most surprising things in the entire document. Not because the number is large, though it is large, but because of what is built inside the number, because of what the scroll insists on preserving, written into the structure of the final war between light and darkness, that no general in any army on earth has ever written into a military campaign. The scroll imagines the war lasting 40 years. Stay with the number before we go into what it contains, because 40 is not an arbitrary figure in the biblical tradition. It carries a specific weight that the community at Qumran knew deeply. Moses spent 40 years learning the courts of Pharaoh, 40 years in the wilderness of Midian learning the desert, 40 years leading Israel from Egypt to the edge of the promised land. 3 40s. 3 complete preparations for the one man who would receive the law and deliver a nation. Moses was on the mountain of Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights. Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights to the mountain of God. Israel wandered 40 years in the desert, the duration long enough to transform a slave people into a covenant people. Jesus went into the wilderness 40 days before his public ministry began. In the biblical imagination, 40 is the number of complete preparation, the season long enough to finish the work, long enough that the person who entered it is not the same person who comes out the other side. When the scroll imagines the final war lasting 40 years, it is saying this conflict is not a skirmish. It is a full and complete preparation, a duration long enough to accomplish the transformation of everything. And now here is what lives inside those 40 years. The scroll does not describe 40 continuous years of battle. It divides the 40 years into a specific, alternating rhythm. 6 years of warfare, followed by 1 year of rest. 6 years of active engagement, then 1 full year in which no fighting takes place at all. Then 6 more years of war, then another year of rest, continuing across the full span of 40 years until the final phase arrives. The year of rest is not a strategic pause. The scroll is explicit about what the year of rest actually is. It is the Sabbath year, the 7th year, the year that the law of God has always set apart, the year in which the land rests, the year in which the rhythm that God built into creation at the beginning is honored in its annual fullness. The community that wrote the war scroll believed they were describing the end of the world, and in their description of the end of the world, they built in the Sabbath year. They could not imagine a reality, not even the final reality, not even the conflict that would end all other conflicts, that did not observe the rhythm God established at the beginning of creation. The sacred structure of time was not a practice they would maintain until something more important came along. It was woven into the fabric of everything. The war could pause. The Sabbath could not be skipped. There is something here worth sitting with. We live in a world that treats rest as something you earn. You work until you have done enough, and then, if there is time left over and the demands have been managed, you rest. Rest is the reward for productivity. Productivity is the default state. The war scroll says the opposite. The scroll imagines the highest stakes possible, the final cosmic conflict between everything good and everything evil, and inside those stakes, it writes in the Sabbath year. Not because the situation has improved enough to justify stopping, because the covenant requires it, because the rhythm was written into creation before the conflict began, because the war that is worth fighting is the war you fight without surrendering the things that make the fighting worth doing. The Qumran community understood this from the inside. They had been in the desert for their own version of 40 years. Displaced, without institutional power, offering nothing to the world that the world valued. And in the middle of that long season, they kept the Sabbath. They prayed before dawn in the cold desert air, not because the circumstances supported it, but because the covenant required it. They built Sabbath years into the final war because they already knew from lived experience what Sabbath years were for. Now, here is one more thing about the number 40, because it belongs tonight. Every person drawn to a document like the War Scroll has almost certainly had their own 40 years in some form. Not literally, but the experience that 40 represents. The long season, the preparation that did not feel like preparation from inside it. The years when you were in the middle of something whose purpose was not visible from where you were standing. Moses did not know, during his 40 years in Midian, learning to shepherd the exact wilderness he would one day lead 2 million people through, that he was in a curriculum. He was just a man tending sheep in a desert that offered him no explanation. The purpose was only apparent from outside it. The scroll was written by people who understood that kind of time. And when they wrote the plan for the final 40 years, they wrote in what they knew. The night around you is its own kind of rest year. Whatever battle waits with tomorrow's first light, this particular darkness belongs to the rhythm that was built into everything before the first conflict began. 6 years, 1 year, 6 years, 1 year, and at the end of the 40, something the scroll saves for its later columns, something that no one standing inside the difficult middle years could fully see from where they stood. But the later columns will keep. Tonight is a Sabbath year in the long campaign. Let it receive you. Chapter 5. Michael and the Armies of the Light. The War Scroll names Michael in its opening columns and does not explain who he is. It assumes, you know. It uses his name the way a military order uses the name of a commanding general as the factual designation of a specific figure with a specific authority whose identity requires no introduction. The scroll was written for people who had been reading about Michael their entire lives. The name Michael in Hebrew is a question, built from 3 words, me, meaning who, ka, meaning like, and el, meaning God. The name asks, who is like God? That question is not rhetorical in the ordinary way. It assumes its own answer. No one is like God. The one who carries this name carries that declaration in every syllable of it. The War Scroll calls Michael the Prince of Light. That title is rooted in a tradition that runs through the prophetic literature, through the book of Daniel in particular, where Michael appears as the great prince who stands guard over the people of Israel, the one who fights in the spiritual realm on behalf of nations and covenants. In the 10th chapter of Daniel, a figure appears to the prophet and tells him something that has puzzled readers for centuries. He tells Daniel that he was sent in response to Daniel's prayer, but that he was delayed for 21 days because the prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood him. He says that Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help him. He then says he must return to fight against the prince of Persia, and after that the prince of Greece will come. That passage describes a world in which earthly events have a spiritual counterpart. Behind the kingdom of Persia stands a prince in the spiritual realm. Behind Greece stands another. Behind Israel stands Michael. The political history of nations is not only what appears on the surface of events. Beneath it, according to this vision, runs another layer of conflict, invisible to ordinary observation, but connected to everything visible. The War Scroll inherits that framework entirely. When it names Michael as the commanding figure of the Sons of Light, the scroll imagines a vision of history in which the battles of nations are the visible surface of a conflict happening simultaneously in a dimension that armies and kings cannot reach with swords. This is why the scroll can describe human troops and angelic forces fighting together in the same formation without any sense of incongruity. According to the scroll's vision, they are engaged in the same conflict at different levels of the same reality. Now I want to be careful here, as I always want to be careful when we are working with these ancient documents. The war scroll is not scripture. The specific details of the angelic commanders and their role in the final conflict are the Qumran community's deeply considered vision, rooted in the prophetic tradition of Israel. It is a vision worth taking seriously. It is not the final word on what the final conflict will look like. The scroll also names 3 other angelic commanders alongside Michael: Gabriel, whose name means God is my strength, and 2 others, with the 4th name appearing in different scholarly translations as either Sariel or Uriel, the variation reflecting genuine difficulty in reading that point in the manuscript. What is not in doubt is the structure the scroll imagines: 4 angelic princes fighting alongside the human formations, one integrated army. That word "alongside" is the one to hold. The scroll does not say the angels will fight instead of the human soldiers. It says they will fight together. The presence of Michael in the formation does not mean the priests and the soldiers can stand at ease while the angels carry the weight. According to the scroll's vision, it means the priests and the soldiers are fighting in the company of Michael. You are probably familiar with the scene in the 6th chapter of the 2nd book of Kings. The Syrian army has surrounded the city of Dothan overnight. Elisha's servant goes out in the morning and sees the army and panics. "What shall we do?" And Elisha prays one sentence: "Lord, open his eyes that he may see." And the servant's eyes are opened, and he sees the hills full of horses and chariots of fire surrounding Elisha. The chariots of fire did not replace the prophet who was already there. They surrounded the prophet who was already there. The human figure and the divine presence occupied the same ground at the same time. The danger was real. The protection was also real. Both things were true simultaneously, and the difference between despair and steadiness was a matter of what you could see. The war scroll imagines the final battle structured the same way. Not a rescue operation in which divine forces arrive because human ones have failed. A joint campaign in which human faithfulness and divine power operate together, because that, according to the scroll's vision of the covenant, is how it has always been. There is something in the name of the commander worth one more moment of attention. The question embedded in Michael's name, who is like God, is also the question that the entire conflict between light and darkness is always pressing. The darkness, under whatever name it operates in any given age, is always making the same claim. I have the authority. I set the terms. I determine what has worth. This is the claim the scroll imagines Belial and his forces pressing forward. And the one sent to oppose that claim carries in the syllables of his own name the answer. No one is like God. The question is closed. The answer was written into the name before the battle began. Let your breathing slow. The formation does not require your watchfulness tonight. The prince, whose name is its own answer to every question the dark raises, has been in his role far longer than any battle in the scroll will last. The formation is holding. Rest in that. Chapter 6. Belial and the Shape of the Dark. The commander of the Sons of Darkness is given a name in the war scroll that almost every modern reader hears backward. Belial sounds like a name of power. It has weight and rhythm in English. It sounds the way the name of a formidable enemy should sound. And that impression, which is entirely understandable, is almost exactly backward from what the name actually means. Belial appears in the Hebrew Bible many times before it appears in the war scroll. In Deuteronomy, in Judges, in Samuel, in the Psalms. Everywhere it appears, Belial is associated not with grand heroic evil, but with a specific and degraded kind of worthlessness. A purposeful emptiness. A refusal of the good so thoroughgoing it has become constitutive of the person it describes. The root of the name means, in the most literal sense, without profit, or without worth, or without the capacity to yield anything of value. Some rabbinic literature passed it as a compound, beli meaning without and ol meaning yoke, suggesting the quality of being ungovernable, accountable to nothing, productive of nothing except what it takes from the things around it. The commander of the sons of darkness is, by the name the scroll gives him, the one who is constitutionally incapable of worth. This is not a minor naming choice. The community at Qumran chose every word in their documents with deliberate care. When they named the commander of darkness with a word that means without worth, they were making a statement about the nature of the conflict itself. The scroll imagines a war in which you are not fighting something that could ultimately win. You are fighting something built from the absence of what wins. Now, the forces aligned under Belial in the scroll's vision are specific. Most scholars identify the Kittim as the Romans. The scroll also names the surrounding peoples with real armies and real histories of conflict with Israel. And it includes those within the covenant community who had accommodated the foreign powers at the cost of their faithfulness. But the scroll's understanding of what Belial actually represents runs deeper than a list of enemy nations. The treatise on the two spirits, which we encountered in chapter 3, illuminates this. The spirit of falsehood, as the treatise describes it, leads toward darkness, not through dramatic evil, but through hollow substitution. The same words, different contents. The same forms, different intent. The same external covenant behavior, different internal allegiance. This is how the scroll imagines Belial operating in practice, not as a monster at the gate, as a voice that knows which words carry authority, that has studied what you care about closely enough to make its offer sound like the thing you were actually looking for. The darkness, in the scroll's vision, does not usually arrive announcing itself. It arrives having borrowed enough of the vocabulary of the light to sound like something worth following. That description is precise in a way that still cuts across 2,000 years. The specific form of darkness that is most difficult to resist is never the darkness that announces itself as such. It is the darkness that has learned to inhabit the forms and language of the light. The Qumran community went into the desert in part because they had watched that voice work on the institutions they had grown up in. They went to the desert so that they could still hear the difference between the form and the substance, between the word and the reality the word was supposed to carry. One more thing about Belial before this chapter rests. The forces of Belial are formidable in the scroll's imagining. They will win rounds. The 40-year duration of the war is not a ceremonial figure. It is the scroll's honest acknowledgement that the darkness will not be overcome quickly. But the commander of the darkness has a name that tells you something essential about the nature of the fight before the first formation is assembled. You are not fighting something that has a destination to reach. You are fighting something organized entirely by opposition that has no vision of what it is fighting toward, only of what it is fighting against. Remove the thing it is opposing, and the darkness has no structure of its own. Its coherence is entirely borrowed from the light it opposes. The hollow thing cannot outlast the full one. It was never built to. The scroll does not spend as many columns on Belial as it does on Michael and the formations of the sons of light. This asymmetry is itself a statement. The darkness is named, identified, its commander described, but it does not merit the same sustained attention as the light. It is a problem to be addressed, not a rival to be studied at length. There is something quietly right about that proportion. Let the night be quiet now. The commander of darkness has been named. Knowing what the name means changes what there is to fear from it. The hollow thing has nothing left to say to the silence. Rest. Chapter 7. The Trumpets. The War Scroll gives more space to trumpets than to almost any other subject in its 19 columns. That surprises most people when they first encounter it. A battle plan for the final conflict between light and darkness. And the document lingers, carefully and at length, on a subject that feels at first glance almost administrative. Trumpets. The specific types, the precise call each must produce, the exact circumstances for each, and most unexpectedly, the inscription that must be engraved into the metal of each instrument before it ever sounds a single note. The reason for that emphasis, once you understand it, changes how you hear everything else in the document. In an ancient battle, the trumpet was not ceremonial. It was the central nervous system of the entire military operation. In a field where thousands of soldiers were spread across a front of half a mile, where the noise of combat made voice commands useless beyond a few feet, where dust and smoke could obscure visual signals within minutes of an engagement beginning, the trumpet was the only means by which a commander could communicate with his forces in real time. A specific call meant advance. A different call meant halt. Another meant withdraw. Another meant pursue. Another meant regroup. Every soldier had to know those calls without hesitation. Because a soldier who misidentified the retreat call as the advance call did not just make a personal error. He moved against the formation. He disrupted the soldiers around him. He could trigger a cascade of confusion that cost an entire unit its coherence at the worst possible moment. The trumpet player was therefore not the most dramatic figure on the battlefield. He was the most trusted one, the person whose reliability, whose consistency, whose absolute precision under the most intense pressure was the thing that kept the formation from dissolving into noise. The war scroll imagines several distinct trumpet calls, each with its own purpose and its own name. The call for the assembly of the whole congregation, the call for the advance of the infantry, the call for the ambush, the call for the pursuit when the enemy breaks, the call for retreat when the battle is going badly and the formation needs to pull back rather than press forward into a situation that will cost more than it gains. And then there is one call that stands apart from all the others. There is the call for the fallen. The scroll specifies that when soldiers have died in the battle, a specific trumpet call will be sounded, not as part of the tactical communication of the fight, as an acknowledgement, made in sound, that someone who was in the formation is no longer in it, that someone who was fighting beside the soldiers still standing has passed through the engagement and will not come back from it. The battle continues. The formation holds, but the call is sounded, and everyone who hears it knows what it means, and the knowing is built into the plan before the first engagement begins. This is one of the most honest things in the entire war scroll. The scroll does not promise the sons of light will take no losses. The call for the fallen is written into the plan. The Qumran community said, "In the language of preparation rather than improvisation, we know this will happen, and we have decided in advance how to mark it." The trumpet player sounds that call when it needs to be sounded. And then, without a pause, he turns his attention back to the next instruction, the next signal, the next communication that the formation is waiting for. That is a specific kind of steadiness, not the steadiness of someone who does not feel the loss. The steadiness of someone who feels the loss and keeps the rhythm anyway. Now let me tell you about something in the scroll that almost no popular account of the document includes. The scroll specifies that each trumpet must carry an inscription engraved on its surface. Not a decorative inscription, a functional one, a statement about what the trumpet is for, carried in the metal of the instrument itself, readable by the person holding it at the moment of greatest pressure. In one standard scholarly rendering of the relevant sections, the inscriptions the scroll imagines for the various trumpets are descriptions of God. The trumpets for the assembly of the congregation bear something that translates as the called of God. The trumpets for the camps carry the phrase, the peace of God. The trumpets for advance bear an inscription about the mighty deeds of God to scatter the enemy. The trumpets for the ambush carry the mysteries of God. Scholars note that specific translations vary across different renderings of the Hebrew text, but the consistent pattern is the same across all scholarly versions. Every inscription carries the name and the character of God. Every signal that goes out from the formation, every call that travels across the field to the ears that need to hear it, passes through an instrument that says something about who God is. The trumpet does not only carry the order, it carries the name, and the person sounding it holds the name in their hands while they sound it. That is a theological statement compressed into a practical military specification. Even in the most operational and intense moments of the final war, the ground of everything is not the strategy or the formation or the courage of the soldiers. It is the God in whose name every signal is sent and every movement is made. This connection with the older tradition is not accidental. The book of Numbers, in the 10th chapter, records Moses being commanded to make 2 silver trumpets for the calling of the congregation and for the breaking up of the camps. The trumpet calls in numbers, the assembly call, the advance signal, the alarm for battle, are the direct ancestors of the calls the war scroll imagines for the final conflict. When the scribe at Qumran wrote down the specifications for the trumpet calls of the 40-year war, he was working in a tradition that ran from the Sinai wilderness through 4 centuries of prophetic literature to the limestone desert above the Dead Sea. Not inventing a new system, completing an old one. There are moments in a life when what is needed is not strength or courage or strategic insight. There are moments when what is needed is someone who will sound the right signal at the right time and let the formation respond. Someone whose steadiness in the role they have been given is the thing that holds the larger movement together. The scroll honors those people. It gives them columns. It specifies their inscriptions. It names the calls they will be required to sound across 40 years of campaign, including the hardest one. The call for the fallen still has to be sounded when it needs to be sounded. And then the next call comes, and the formation is still there, and the battle continues. The night is quiet around you now. The trumpets are at rest in this Sabbath year of the campaign. The inscriptions on the metal are still there in the dark, the same words they have always been. When the morning comes, the signals will be there. Chapter 8. What was written on the weapons? The war scroll deepens in its later columns. The urgency of the opening sections gives way to something different as the document moves through its 19 columns. The language broadens. The sentences lengthen and settle, the way water deepens as a river moves away from the mountain and into the wide valley below. This is where the scroll describes the banners and the inscriptions on the weapons of the sons of light. And this is where the battle plan, without ever quite stopping being a battle plan, moves in the direction of something closer to poetry than logistics. The scroll imagines specific banners carried into the final war. The standard of the whole congregation first, then the standards of the individual tribes, then the standards of the thousands and the hundreds and the 50s and the 10s, all the way down through every level of the formation. Each banner is described in terms of its dimensions and the inscription it must carry. The inscription of the great standard carried at the very head of the whole formation, the scroll imagines, is simply the name of God. Not the might of God, not the victory of God, not even the faithfulness of God. The name itself, offered without modification, without context, without editorial addition, bare and specific and exact. The formation advances behind the name, not behind a claim about what the name will accomplish, not behind a promise about what the name guarantees, behind the name. In the Exodus account, when Moses asked God his name at the burning bush, the answer he received was not a title or a description. It was a statement about existence itself. I am who I am. A name that is a declaration of presence rather than a description from the outside. The name that says, I am here, I am present, I am the ground you are standing on. That is the name on the great standard of the sons of light, as the scroll imagines it. And the formation advances behind it because everything else the battle plan requires flows from that one fact. The smaller unit banners carry a different kind of inscription. In various scholarly translations of the relevant columns, the phrases carried on the pennants of individual companies include meanings along the lines of the truth of God, the justice of God, the glory of God, and the faithfulness of God. The units bearing these pennants advance carrying, literally in their hands, a statement about what the scroll believes the war is being fought to protect. I want to be honest about something here, because this is a point where the modern reader and the ancient writer are standing in different places, and the gap deserves naming. We live in a world that knows what can happen when God's name is written on weapons and banners. History is full of armies that carried religious inscriptions into battles that were nothing more than political ambitions dressed in sacred language. That history is real, and it should make a careful reader appropriately cautious. But there is something specific in the scroll's use of these inscriptions that sets them apart. The scroll is explicit in its liturgical sections that the victory of the sons of light will not be the achievement of human valor. The weapons are inscribed not as a claim that God endorses the army's agenda. They are inscribed as a reminder to the person holding the weapon of what the war is for and who is actually responsible for its outcome. The inscription is not a permission slip. It is a standard the carrier is held to. You are holding the faithfulness of God. Are you being faithful? The community at Qumran had watched the vocabulary of the covenant used to justify its opposite. They responded not by abandoning sacred language, but by insisting that the language be carried honestly in forms that made demands on the carrier, rather than simply authorizing the carrier to make demands on others. There is one image from this section I want to stay with before this chapter closes. The scroll imagines the great standard at the head of the entire formation bearing the name of God alone. Not an argument, not a theological case for why their side deserves to prevail. The name, because the name is the one thing that is always true, always present, always the same, regardless of what the circumstances around it are doing. The one thing the darkness cannot hollow out, cannot borrow, cannot empty and refill with its own content. There is a question in this image that the dark tonight has room for. What is at the front of where you are going? Not the word you have adopted because it sounds right. The actual ground you stand on when the morning comes and the day begins. The scroll imagines an army that knows exactly what name is on the great standard. They wrote it there themselves. They carry it without confusion about what it says. Let your breathing slow now. The banners are folded in this rest year. The inscriptions are still there in the dark, patient and exact. The name is at the front. The formation knows where it is going. Rest. Chapter 9. The Three Falls. Before the prophet Elijah ran into the wilderness and lay down under a juniper tree and asked God to let him die, he had just won the most visible victory of his ministry. He had called down fire from heaven on Mount Carmel in front of all Israel. He had ended a 3-year drought with a single prayer and a cloud the size of a man's hand rising from the sea. He had stood alone against 450 prophets of Baal, and the God of Israel had answered, and the false prophets had not. The people had fallen on their faces. And then Elijah ran. He ran because a queen named Jezebel sent him a message saying she would have him killed within 24 hours, and he believed her. He left his servant behind. He went a day's journey into the wilderness alone. He sat down under the tree, and he said, "It is enough. It is enough." The man who had watched heaven answer fire with fire sat down in the desert and told God he was done. I want to hold that image before we enter this chapter, because it is the emotional center of what the war scroll says in the section we are about to examine. The greatest visible victory, the immediate aftermath that looked like absolute collapse. The distance between the mountaintop and the juniper tree measured not in miles, but in a single sleepless night and one threatening sentence. The war scroll, as scholars have interpreted its battle sequence, describes the final conflict as a series of engagements. The sons of light and the sons of darkness meet in battle repeatedly across the 40-year campaign. And according to one scholarly reading of the scroll's battle sequence, specifically the columns that describe the phases of the central conflict, the sons of light do not win every round. According to this reading, the scroll imagines the darkness having the upper hand in several of the earlier engagements before the final resolution. The formation of the sons of light is pressed back. Ground is lost. Anyone standing on that field in those moments and looking honestly at what is happening would have to say, the light is losing. I want to be careful about the nature of this claim. The War Scroll's battle sequence is genuinely complex, and scholars continue to discuss how best to read it. What is not in doubt is the overall shape of the conflict as the scroll imagines it, which includes phases where the darkness is in the ascendant before the final turn. The scroll does not promise smooth progress for the Sons of Light. It promises a difficult campaign that ends in a specific way that the difficult middle phases do not predict. That is the first extraordinary thing about this section. The second is what the scroll describes happening after those difficult phases. Not a strategic regrouping, not a tactical adjustment. What the scroll describes is a liturgical response. The priests and the Levites, the figures at the center of the formation whose role is not primarily military but priestly, lift their voices. The trumpets sound, and then the priests pray. The prayer the scroll places at these turning points is one of the most beautiful passages in the entire Qumran collection. It begins not with a petition but with a blessing. In one standard scholarly translation, the opening reads something like, "Blessed be the God of Israel, who keeps his covenant of mercy with our fathers, and who remembers his covenant of salvation with the people he has redeemed." Notice where the prayer starts, not with the crisis, not with the immediate emergency of the formation having been pressed back. With the covenant, with the fact that God has kept his promises in the past. The prayer begins with who God has always been before it, asks for what is needed now. This is the structure of prayer under pressure that the Hebrew tradition preserved through the Psalms and the prophets. You begin with who God is. You place the covenant before the crisis, because beginning with who God is changes the shape of the crisis. It relocates the emergency inside a larger frame. The darkness pressing against the formation right now is not the whole story, because the whole story belongs to a God who has never yet failed to keep his covenant. After the prayer, the battle turns. Now come back to Elijah under the juniper tree, because the angel's response to him in that moment is the same shape as the scroll's response to the sons of light after their difficult phases. When the angel came to Elijah, the angel did not offer strategy. The angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." And when Elijah had eaten and lain down again, the angel came a second time and touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." The journey is too great for you. Those 6 words are carrying more weight than they appear to. Not, you are not strong enough, so the mission is cancelled. The journey is too great for you means the journey requires more than you can produce from within your own reserves, and that is why you have been given bread, and that is why the angel touches you twice, and that is why the wilderness that looks like abandonment is actually the place where what you need for the next stage is being provided. Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights to the mountain of God on the strength of those 2 meals. The experience that looked like total collapse was the preparation for the next chapter of what God was doing through him. The scroll was written by people who had lain down under their own juniper trees. They had gone to the desert to preserve what they believed was worth preserving, with no certainty it would work. They had watched everything they loved in Jerusalem be dismantled. And they had written the difficult phases into the battle plan because they already knew from lived experience that losing rounds are not evidence the plan has failed. They are evidence that the plan is real and that the journey is great, which means provisions are being made. If you are, At this particular moment in your life, in one of the losing phases of something you believed was worth fighting for, here is what the scroll was written to say. According to the Qumran community's vision, the difficult phases were written into the plan, not overlooked by it. Written in. The formation that is in the ascendant before you reached your juniper tree will still be there after you leave it. The bread is there. The journey continues. Let your breathing slow now, the way Elijah's must have slowed when the food was in his body and the angel had come twice and the desert air was finally quiet around him. The difficult phase has its place in the plan. The prayer after it has a shape. The juniper tree is a good place to rest. Chapter 10. When God enters the field. There is a moment in the war scroll where the document stops giving operational instructions. It happens near the end of the battle sequence. The 40 years have moved through their phases. The formations have assembled and fought and held and lost ground and prayed and held again. And then, in the columns that describe the final phase of the conflict, the scroll does something that no purely military manual has ever done. It stops planning, and it starts praying. Picture the scribe in the scriptorium at Qumran writing these final columns. His pen has been moving steadily for many pages, through formations and trumpet calls and banner inscriptions and the dimensions of shields. And now he lifts his pen from the leather and holds it still for a moment. He looks at the columns he has written. He sets the pen down again. When he picks it up once more, the language changes. The operational specifications fall away. What replaces them is something the document has been pointing toward since the first column, but has not yet arrived at directly. Something that the 40 years of formations and trumpet calls and banner inscriptions were all preparing for, without being able to produce on their own. The prayer. That transition from plan to prayer is the most important thing in the entire document. Not because the prayer is beautiful, though it is, but because the transition itself is the theology. The plan was always pointing toward a moment it could not describe from the inside. The 40 years of preparation were the community's attempt to be ready, to be in position, to be the kind of people who could participate in the final movement of the conflict. But participation is not control. And the scroll knew the difference. The prayer that the war scroll places at the climax of the final battle begins with a word that no military manual has ever started with. Blessed. Not help us. Not destroy them. Not give us strength. The prayer begins with the word blessed, addressed to the God of Israel, for who he has always been. In one standard scholarly translation, the opening reads, "Blessed be the God of Israel, who keeps his covenant of mercy with our fathers, and who remembers his covenant of salvation with the people he has redeemed." Before it asks for anything, before it names any need, before it acknowledges the crisis at all, the prayer places itself inside the larger history of a God who keeps his covenant. The people who wrote this prayer had watched the darkness win in their own lives. Their Jerusalem had been compromised. Their community had been displaced. Their temple had been corrupted. By the time they were in the desert writing this scroll, the world they had grown up in was functionally gone. And they began their prayer by saying, "You keep your covenant of mercy with our fathers." Not, "You kept it once." Not, "You will keep it again if we prove ourselves." You keep it. Present tense. Active. Ongoing. The covenant of mercy has not been suspended by the darkness. The darkness is operating inside a story that belongs to a God who keeps his promises, and that story has a different ending than the darkness imagines. The prayer continues, calling up the memory of the fathers, the covenants with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the Exodus, the great hand and the outstretched arm, the language of the sea parting and the freed people standing on the far shore with the water behind them. And then the prayer makes its request. In the scroll's imagining, translated across various scholarly renderings of the Hebrew, the prayer calls for God to rise. to raise himself in his might, to let the enemies be scattered, to let the light of his face shine on his sanctuary and his people. Rise up, not come assist us. The image is of a king who has been seated, watching, allowing the human portion of the story to run its course, and who now stands. The standing of God in the scroll's vision is not an increase in the intensity of what was already happening. It is a qualitative change. The human battle and the angelic formation and the 40 years of faithful preparation were the prelude. The rising of God, according to the scroll's vision, is what the prelude was always pointing toward. I want to be careful here, as I always want to be careful when working with these ancient documents. The war scroll is not scripture. Its vision of the direct intervention of God in the final battle is the Qumran community's deeply considered reading of the prophetic tradition of Israel, developed with great seriousness and preserved with extraordinary care. What happens in history is not determined by what the Qumran community believed would happen, but the shape of what they believed. The structure of their hope deserves careful attention. The shape is this. The plan was never fight hard enough and win through the accumulation of human effort alone. The scroll imagines the plan as stand in the right place, do the faithful thing, hold the formation in the difficult phases, sound the call for the fallen, and return to the next signal. Pray after the losses with a prayer that begins with blessing rather than petition, and trust that the moment the plan is pointing toward belongs to a different category than any moment human preparation can produce. Moses raised his staff and stretched it over the water before the sea parted. Elijah soaked the altar with water 3 times over before the fire fell. The human act of preparation was always present before the divine act of completion arrived. The preparation was not what produced the completion, but the completion came to the preparation. For readers in the Christian tradition, the language the scroll uses in this prayer, the call for God to rise, the light shining on his people, the final defeat of the power of darkness, will sound like a vocabulary they know from elsewhere. Christian readers may hear, in the Qumran community's vision of the moment when God enters the field, echoes of what the New Testament describes in its own vocabulary. The same categories, the same movement from human faithfulness to divine completion. This is not what the Qumran community itself was saying. They were Jewish. Their hope was the hope of Israel. Their prayer was addressed to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But the language they were praying in was part of what scholars have called the shared air of first-century Judea, a vocabulary that shaped how people in that world described ultimate things, and that later writers drew on for their own purposes in their own documents. The connection is real. The difference between the communities is also real. What the scroll records, across all the scholarly discussions, is the shape of the hope that the plan is not finished when it looks finished, the hope that the difficult phases are not the final phase, the hope that what the plan is pointing toward is coming even when it cannot be seen from inside the phase you are currently in. Wherever you are in the battle sequence right now, the scroll says this. The plan continues. The difficult phases are not the final phase. The prayer after the losses is not the end of the story. And ahead, in the scroll's vision, the God who keeps his covenant of mercy rises, and what the darkness was trying to prevent begins. The formation is not yours to manage tonight. Let your hands open. The lamplight in the scriptorium is still. The scribe has set down his pen. The columns are written. The plan is complete, and the rising in the scroll's hope is already in motion. Rest now. The desert above Qumran is quiet. The scroll is in the light. The covenant is still there in the dark, patient and exact, the same it has always been.
Chapter 11. The Sealing and the Found. We began with a broken jar, a pale limestone cliff above the Dead Sea, a teenage shepherd looking for a lost goat, A stone thrown into a dark opening in the rock. A sound that was not the sound of stone hitting stone. We end in the same place. Not because the story has gone in a circle without moving, but because circles are one of the ways a long story tells you what it has been about. You arrive at the end where you started, and you are different, and the beginning looks different because of the distance you have traveled. Come back to the cliff face above Qumran. Come back to a night that has no exact date in the records we have, sometime in the year 68 of the Common Era, when the Roman 10th Legion had left Jericho and was moving south. The community of the Yahad had perhaps days, perhaps only hours, before the army arrived. Picture the settlement in its final hours. The plateau, narrow and pale in the desert dark. The water channels carved into the rock, empty in the dry season. The communal dining room where the bread had been blessed and the wine had been shared every evening for nearly 2 centuries, silent now, the long tables bare. The scriptorium where the inkwells had dried and the writing benches carried the shapes of absent hands. Someone moves through the settlement. The scrolls are gathered. They are wrapped in linen, the same linen that archaeologists would find in fragments 2,000 years later, identifiable by its weave, preserved by the same dry air that had preserved everything else. The war scroll goes into a jar. The document that imagined the 40 years and the formations, and the call for the fallen, and the prayer that begins with blessing, and the vision of God rising into the final phase, goes into a jar, and the lid is fitted, and the seams are sealed. They sealed it. They climbed the cliff, and they did not come back for the scrolls. The terrain from the settlement to the cave openings is steep and loose in places, the kind of surface where you have to think about every step, where a jar that slipped from a tired grip would shatter on the rocks below. Getting there, with arms full of clay, in whatever light was available, under whatever time pressure existed, was not easy. They did it anyway. We do not know how many trips were made. We do not know whether they finished. We know only that the jars reached the caves, and the caves held them, and the desert kept them, and the darkness did not destroy them. And then 1,979 years passed. Think about what that means in human terms, not as a round number. Each of those years containing 4 seasons, 52 Sabbaths, the births and deaths of people who never heard of Qumran, the rise and fall of empires that the community at Qumran had not yet imagined, the continuation of the story they believed was heading somewhere, each year and each decade and each century, carrying that story forward through hands and places and languages the Qumran writers could not have named. The jars held through all of it. Not because they were miraculous, because the desert air was dry and the limestone caves were stable and someone had sealed the jars with care before the emergency arrived. The emet of the clay and the fitted lids and the sealed seams was the preservation of what the emet of the community had produced. The natural faithfulness of the desert keeping human faithfulness intact, the way the world sometimes does when the preparation has been done with sufficient care. And then a boy who was looking for a lost goat threw a stone into a cave and heard something break. That sound, the sharp crack, the hollow resonance, not stone hitting stone. That is the sound this whole night has been building toward. Not a dramatic announcement, not trumpets or a voice from heaven or any of the signals by which important arrivals are supposed to make themselves known. The sound of a clay jar, sealed and patient in the dark for 2,000 years, finally giving way to something as ordinary as a stone thrown by a boy who was not looking for anything sacred. The great arrivals almost never announce themselves. They come through the ordinary action of someone who was not looking for what they found, in circumstances that did not feel significant until afterward, by means of something as unremarkable as a thrown stone. The war scroll is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem right now, in the Shrine of the Book, the vault built in the shape of the lid of the very jars in which it was found. Behind glass, In a climate-controlled case, the leather is dark, and the columns of text are still readable after 2,000 years of desert silence. You can lean close to the glass and see the individual letters, the precise hand of a scribe who wrote about the 40 years, and the formations, and the call for the fallen, and the prayer that begins with blessing, and the vision of God rising to complete what faithfulness had prepared. He sealed the jar carefully. He climbed the cliff. He placed what he was carrying where the darkness could not reach it. And tonight, after 2,000 years, those words reach this night. Consider what it took to get them here. Every hand that copied the scroll before the jar, every year of dry desert air inside the jar, the specific quality of limestone in those specific caves, the path of a specific goat on a specific morning that led a specific teenager to a specific opening in the rock, the decades of scholarship that translated what he found, and the night you are in right now, quiet enough to receive what was preserved. The chain that runs from a lamplight room in 1st century Judea to the room where you are resting now is a long one. The Qumran community sealed the jar because they believed the words would still matter to someone on the other side of whatever was coming. They believed there would be someone worth preserving it for. The ancient words have found you, and in whatever quiet way this night allows, you are receiving what they preserved. Rest in that. The emet that sealed the jar is the same emet that carried it across 2,000 years and brought it here. Patient as limestone, reliable as dry air, present in the same faithful way, regardless of what the circumstances have been doing. The cave is empty now. The scroll is in the light. The darkness above Qumran is the same darkness it has always been, patient and unchanged, holding the same silence it held for 2,000 years before the jar was found. And the darkness does not get the last word. It never did. Not once in the entire length of this long story. Not tonight. Sleep well. This is Night Psalms. The ancient words have found you, and we will go searching together again soon.